Picture this, a blizzard screaming sideways across a Yorkshire ridge, snow so thick it blinds archers mid-draw, and beneath that white curtain, a sound that doesn't belong unto weather, a wet, rhythmic crunching, thousands of boots pressing down on something softer than frozen earth, bodies, layers of them, till warm beneath the frost. A man stumbles, catches himself on what he thinks is a fallen log. His gauntlet closes around frozen fingers. He doesn't scream, screaming stopped hours ago. Now there's only the mechanical work of killing, the dull repetition of blade finding flesh, the splash of blood already cooling to slush before it hits the ground. The smell is wrong. Battlefields should reek of iron and shit. This one smells like a butcher's shop left open in winter. Cold meat and copper, preserved by the freeze, concentrated by the thousands. Men who ate breakfast together 8 hours ago now form a carpet 3 bodies deep in places. Palm Sunday they're calling it, the holiest massacre in English history. Somewhere behind the lines, in a tent that might as well be 1,000 miles from this slaughter, a king kneels in prayer. His lips move, his eyes see nothing. The crown that caused all this death sits heavy on a head that cannot comprehend violence, cannot process strategy, cannot remember most mornings whether he dressed himself or was dressed. King Henry VI, anointed by God, broken by blood. His army is dying in that field. The army his wife raised, his wife commanded, his wife drove north through hostile territory with a ferocity that terrifies even her allies. Margaret of Anjou doesn't kneel. Margaret watches from a ridge, her son beside her teaching the 7-year-old Prince Edward what happens when you show weakness, the lesson you don't. Across that corpse field, another young man is learning the same lesson differently. Edward of York, 18 years old, tall enough that men can see him above the chaos, golden-haired like something from a troubadour's song. 3 months ago, his father's head rotted on a spike above York's gates, wearing a paper crown as mockery. Edward doesn't pray, Edward kills, his sword arm hasn't stopped for 9 hours. The Lancastrian line broke once, reformed, broke again. Now it's not breaking, it's dissolving. Men running north toward a river already swollen with snowmelt. They don't know the bridge has collapsed. They won't know until they're drowning, until the weight of armour pulls them under, until the bodies stack so thick that other men run across them like a bridge and those men drown too. The rivercock will flow red for 3 days. Locals will refuse to eat fish from it for a decade. Historians still debate whether 30,000 died that day or merely 20,000, as if the difference matters, as if halving the number makes it less than the bloodiest single day in English history, more English dead than any battle before or since, more than the Somme first morning, more than any day of any war this island has ever inflicted upon itself. And for what? 2 branches of the same family? 2 interpretations of a claim that traces back 60 years to a usurpation everyone agreed to forget. Cousins slaughtering cousins. Uncles butchering nephews. Men who danced at each other's weddings now ankle deep in each other's intestines. The Plantagenet dynasty, the bloodline that gave England the Lionheart, that conquered Wales, that nearly conquered France, is eating itself alive. The man fleeing through that blizzard, the praying king with the broken mind, bears a name that should command obedience. Henry, 6th of that name, grandson of the warrior king who humiliated France at Agincourt, heir to a legacy of fire and conquest. He inherited an empire. He will die in a prison cell, murdered so quietly that history cannot agree on the method or the murderer. His wife will die in exile, begging charity from the French king who used her as a pawn. His son, that boy, watching from the ridge, learning that weakness is death, will be cut down at 17, the Lancastrian line extinguished in a field called Tewkesbury. But that's later. Right now, on this frozen Palm Sunday in 1461, there is only the killing, only the snow turning pink, then red, then black with frozen blood, only 2 armies of Englishmen proving that civil war is the cruelest arithmetic. The more you kill, the more enemies you create. How does a kingdom reach this point? How does a ruling class, bound by marriage, by shared ancestors, by decades of fighting side by side in France, decide that extermination is preferable to compromise? The answer lies in a hollow crown, a mad king, and the terrible truth that Shakespeare understood centuries later. The Wars of the Roses weren't caused by evil men. They were caused by a system that made murder logical. The snow at Towton had a grandfather. 62 years before that blizzard, On a September evening in 1399, a different scene played. Out in the Tower of London, quieter, colder in its own way, and infinitely more consequential. King Richard II sat in a chamber stripped of its tapestries, stripped of its dignity, stripped of everything except the man who'd come to take his crown. Henry Bolingbroke didn't look like a usurper. He looked like a cousin, because he was. Richard had exiled him. Richard had stolen his inheritance when his father died. Richard had pushed and pushed and pushed until pushing back became the only language left. Now Bolingbroke sat across from the anointed king and explained very calmly that Richard would abdicate or Richard would die, and that abdication would probably still lead to death, but at least it would be quieter. Richard signed. The crown passed to Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV, who spent the rest of his reign crushing rebellions from men who noticed that if one usurpation worked, perhaps another might. He died exhausted at 45, his skin covered in lesions that priests whispered were God's judgment for stealing the throne. His son, Henry V, inherited the crown and the guilt. So he did what guilty kings do. He found a foreign enemy. France, Agincourt, the longbow volleys that mowed down French knights like wheat. A legend was born, a warrior king who seemed to prove that God had forgiven the usurpation after all. Henry V died at 35, his body broken by dysentery contracted at a siege, leaving behind a French wife, a treaty that promised him the throne of France and a son. That son was 9 months old. The infant who had become Henry VI inherited 2 crowns, England and France, before he could walk. By the time he could speak, regents governed in his name. By the time he reached manhood, he had never made a decision that wasn't managed by uncles, advisors, factions circling him like wolves around a wounded deer. He was gentle. Chronicles agree on this. Henry VI loved books, loved prayer, loved the quiet of chapel more than the noise of court. He founded Eton College and Men's College, Cambridge, monuments to learning that still stand. He forgave enemies when forgiveness was politically suicidal. He wept at executions he'd been forced to order. He was, in short, catastrophically wrong for the throne. Historians still debate whether his condition was what modern medicine would call schizophrenia, or catatonic depression, or something else entirely. What they know is this. In August 1453, Henry VI collapsed. Not physically. He could still walk, still eat when fed. But the king was no longer present behind his eyes. He didn't recognise his wife. He didn't recognise his newborn son. He sat where placed, stared at nothing, and vanished inside himself for 17 months. The kingdom didn't stop. The kingdom couldn't stop because France was on fire. Every gain from Agincourt, every fortress, every province was crumbling. Normandy fell, Gascony fell. The English empire that Henry V had built was being erased, while his son drooled in a Windsor bedchamber, and the men who were supposed to govern in his name had been fighting each other for years. 2 factions, 2 families, 2 claims to power that had been accumulating grievances like a miser hoards coins. The first, Lancaster, the king's own party, though the king couldn't lead it. At its head, Margaret of Anjou, the French queen who had arrived in England at 15 and discovered that her husband was a man-shaped absence, that her new country despised her for being French, and that the only way to survive was to become harder than the men who sneered at her. The second, York, Richard, Duke of York, whose bloodline was arguably better than Henry's own. His mother descended from an elder son of Edward III, Henry descended from a younger. If legitimacy were mathematics, York had the stronger claim. He'd served the crown faithfully in France, watched his military successes ignored, watched favourites enriched while he went unpaid, watched a French queen install her cronies while veterans starved. York didn't want the throne. This is important. In 1453, Richard of York wanted what most magnates wanted: influence, respect, payment of debts the crown owed him, and the removal of Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, who he blamed for losing France and poisoning the king against him. He didn't want Henry's crown. Not yet. But here's the machinery that makes civil war inevitable. When a kingdom has no functioning king, power must flow somewhere. It flowed to whoever could seize it. And seizure creates enemies. Enemies create fear. Fear creates preemptive violence. Violence creates vendettas that last generations. Margaret understood this. When Henry woke from his stupor in December 1454, blinking at a world that had moved on without him. Margaret had already learned the lesson that would define her. Power isn't given to queens. Power is tyr, and anyone who stands in the way, York, his allies, his entire bloodline, must be destroyed before they destroy you. She looked at her husband, at his gentle confusion, at his absolute inability to protect himself or their son, and Margaret decided she would become the protector. England was about to discover what a mother's love looks like when it has armies. The letter arrived in Ireland on a ship that stank of salt fish and desperation. Richard of York read it twice, then a third time, as if repetition might change the words. England had collapsed. The king's mind was gone. Somerset's faction was bleeding the treasury dry, and the lords who still believed in good governance, what remained of them, begged York to return, to save them, to save the kingdom from itself. The deck pitched beneath his boots. Dublin harbour stretched grey and unwelcoming behind him. He'd been exiled to this post, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, which sounded important and meant nothing, a way for Somerset to remove him from English politics without the mess of an execution. Now they wanted him back. York's hands were scarred from 2 decades of war. He'd fought in France before he could properly grow a beard. He'd watched English armies crumble, not from enemy strength, but from English incompetence, English corruption, English lords who cared more about enriching themselves than holding Normandy. He'd submitted plan after plan for reform. He'd been ignored, dismissed, slandered as ambitious when all he wanted. What did he want? Historians still debate whether York's later actions reveal secret ambition from the start, or whether circumstance pushed a loyal man past loyalty's limit. What the chronicles show is a pattern. York consistently sought accommodation before confrontation. He petitioned, he complained through proper channels, he bent the knee even when bending felt like breaking. But Somerset kept pushing, and eventually pushed men push back. York returned to England in 1450 with a small army which terrified everyone despite his protest that it was merely an escort. He met with the king, the gentle, bewildered Henry who smiled at everyone and remembered nothing. York knelt. York swore loyalty. York asked only that Somerset face charges for losing France. Somerset faced no charges. Instead, Somerset remained at Henry's side while York was politely excluded from the council. The message was clear. The Queen and her favourites would rather see England burn than share power with a man whose claim to the throne was stronger than their own. Because that was the unspoken terror behind every interaction. York's lineage, his descent from Lionel of Antwerp, second surviving son of Edward III, versus Henry's descent from John of Gaunt, the third surviving son. By the rules of primogeniture that governed inheritance of every other title in England, York should be king. He never said this. He never had to. Everyone at court could count generations. Everyone knew the mathematics of blood. And everyone watched York for the slightest hint of treason, which meant everything he did looked treasonous regardless of intent. The first breakdown came in 1452. York marched south with another army, this time openly demanding Somerset's arrest. He camped at Dartford. Royal forces surrounded him. Outnumbered, he negotiated, laid down arms in exchange for promises that Somerset would face justice. The promises were lies. Within hours of disarming, York found himself kneeling in St. Paul's Cathedral, swearing a public oath of loyalty while Somerset smirked from the crowd. The humiliation was deliberate. The message, "You lost, you will always lose, you exist because we permit it." Then Henry's mind shattered. The king's collapse in August 1453 changed mathematics. A regency was needed, someone to rule while Henry stared at walls. Somerset expected the role. Margaret expected to control whoever held it. Parliament chose York. He became Lord Protector of England, which meant every decision was his fault. Every failure was ammunition for his enemies. And every success convinced Margaret that he must be destroyed before he destroyed them. He released political prisoners. He began reforming finances. He genuinely tried to govern responsibly. For 14 months it worked. Then Henry woke up. Christmas 1454. The king blinked, looked around and asked about his son, the son born during his stupor, the son he'd never seen. Margaret presented the baby. Henry smiled his gentle smile, and just like that, York's protectorate ended. Somerset was released from the Tower within days. York's reforms were rolled back within weeks. By February, York had been stripped of his position, expelled from court, and informed that his safety could not be guaranteed if he remained in London. Margaret's allies whispered that attainder was coming, the legal process that would strip York of his titles, his lands, his everything. Maybe his head. York retreated north. He gathered his allies, the Neville family, the Earls of Salisbury, and Warwick, men who'd also been pushed out, also been humiliated, also been told their service meant nothing against court favourites. They weren't planning treason, they were planning survival. But survival, in a kingdom where the king couldn't govern and the queen governed through vendetta, looked exactly like rebellion. And rebellion, once it starts, develops its own logic. A logic that ends with severed heads and paper crowns and 30,000 corpses freezing in a Yorkshire blizzard. York still believed he could negotiate. He was about to learn otherwise. The Queen's chambers smelled of lavender and conspiracy. Margaret of Anjou stood at a window overlooking the Thames, watching cargo boats slide through grey water, her reflection ghosted in the glass. A woman who'd arrived in England 10 years ago as a girl of 15 and had been underestimated every single day since. They called her the French woman, as if France were a disease. They blamed her for the loss of Normandy, as if she'd personally surrendered fortresses while still learning them English. They mocked her influence over her husband, not understanding that someone had to make decisions while Henry counted rosary beads and wept at clouds. Margaret had not asked for this. She'd been bargained across the channel like livestock, married to a stranger, deposited in a hostile court where everyone smiled and no one could be trusted. Her dowry was humiliating. France paid nothing, surrendered at nothing, while England gave up Maine and Anjou just to marry her off. The English lords never forgave her for this, as if she'd negotiated her own wedding contract at 15. The baby changed everything. Edward, Prince of Wales, born October 1453 while his father's mind wandered in darkness. A son, an heir, proof that the Lancastrian line would continue, an absolute certainty that Margaret would burn England to cinders before letting York anywhere near her child's inheritance. Historians still debate whether Margaret's ferocity was madness or the only sane response to her situation. Consider, her husband could collapse again at any moment. York's claim was legally stronger. Half the nobility wanted her gone, and every lesson from French history taught that Queen's Regent were tolerated until they became inconvenient, then imprisoned, poisoned, or worse. Margaret chose not to be convenient. Her first weapon was patronage. Lands, titles, positions distributed to men loyal to her specifically, not to the abstract crown. Her banned weapon was marriage, binding families to her cause through daughters and dowries. Her third weapon was Somerset. Then after Somerset was killed, other men who understood that their survival depended on hers. But her sharpest weapon was fear. Not fear of her personally, though, that was growing. Fear of what York represented. She painted him as a usurper in waiting, a man who would steal her son's birthright the moment Henry showed weakness. Every Yorkshire ally became a traitor. Every reform proposal became a plot. Every letter became evidence of conspiracy. She made it true by treating it as true. The propaganda was relentless. Royal letters portrayed York as ungrateful, ambitious, dangerous. Court sermons compared him to Lucifer, the rebel angel who thought himself equal to his creator. Margaret understood something her husband never could. Politics is narrative, and whoever controls the story controls the outcome. York kept trying to control facts instead. He sent letters explaining his positions. He sought meetings, arbitration, compromise. He behaved as if Margaret were a rational actor who could be convinced by evidence. This was his great miscalculation. Margaret wasn't irrational. She was operating on different logic entirely. Her logic was survival, and survival meant York had to go. The court at Coventry in 1456 became her stronghold, far from London, far from York's power base, surrounded by Lancastrian lords who owed everything to her patronage. The king held formal sessions, smiled at petitioners, signed what was placed before him. Margaret held actual power, receiving intelligence, dispatching orders, building the coalition that would eventually destroy the House of York. Except it would also destroy her. That's the tragedy Margaret couldn't see. Every action she took to protect her son made his position more precarious. Every ally she empowered demanded concessions that weakened royal authority. Every enemy she made swore vengeance not just on her, but on the Lancastrian cause entire. The spiral was accelerating. York's allies, the Nevilles, had been pushed out of their northern strongholds by Margaret's favourites. The Earl of Salisbury had been ambushed, his men killed, his dignity stripped. The Earl of Warwick, the most dangerous man in England, had been mocked publicly for failures that weren't his fault. They were past reconciliation now. Margaret had made certain of that. So they prepared for war. Not rebellion, not usurpation. They still swore loyalty to King Henry. But loyalty to the king, they argued, required removing the evil counsellors around him. The fiction was thin. Everyone knew that evil counsellors meant Margaret. Everyone knew that removing her meant battle. In the spring of 1455, Margaret summoned a great council at Leicester. York and the Nevilles were commanded to attend, which meant walking into enemy territory, surrounded by hostile lords, trusting the Queen who wanted them dead. They refused to come as supplicants, they came as an army. 2,500 men marched south, carrying a petition that demanded Somerset's arrest and their own restoration to the King's Council. They claimed they came in peace. They claimed they threatened no one. Their sword said otherwise. The two forces met at St Albans. England was about to learn what Englishmen could do to each other. The first arrow found flesh at 10 in the morning. St Albans was a market town, not a battlefield. Narrow streets, timber houses, surprised merchants diving behind stalls as men in plate armour hacked at each other between the butcher's shop and the tanner's yard, the smell of fresh bread mixed with the copper stench of opened arteries. This wasn't war as anyone understood it. This was murder in a high street. York's forces had arrived demanding negotiation. The King's party, barricaded in the town centre, had stalled for hours. Messages passed back and forth, compromises offered and rejected, time bought for reinforcements that never came. By mid-morning, patience had rotted away. The Yorkists attacked through gardens. The Earl of Warwick led the flanking assault, his men smashing through back fences, emerging in the market square behind Lancastrian barricades that faced the wrong direction. The defensive line collapsed inward like a crushed ribcage. Within minutes, the battle became a hunt. Somerset died in a doorway. The man Margaret had protected, the man York had demanded justice against for years, cornered outside a tavern called the Castle Inn. Accounts differ on whether he fought bravely or died screaming. What's certain, Yorkist soldiers found him, recognised him, and butchered him so thoroughly that his body required reconstruction before burial. The Earl of Northumberland died in the street. Lord Clifford died somewhere in the chaos. King Henry took an arrow to the neck. Not fatal, the wound was shallow, more graze than penetration, but the sight of the anointed king bleeding, his guards scattered, his enemies closing in, this was something England hadn't seen in generations. Henry stood bewildered in the doorway of a tanner's cottage while fighting swirled around him, unable to comprehend why anyone would hurt anyone. Unable to run, unable to fight, unable to do anything except exist as a symbol everyone claimed to serve while trying to control. York found him there. The Duke knelt in the bloody street, armour spattered with evidence of the morning's work, and swore, again, that he meant no harm to his sovereign. That all of this, the dead lords, the burning houses, the screaming wounded, was done in the king's service, to remove evil counsellors, to restore good governance, to protect Henry from those who misled him. Henry probably believed it. Henry believed most things he was told. His gentle mind couldn't process treachery, couldn't imagine that men who knelt so prettily might be kneeling on the corpses of other men who'd knelt just as prettily. He blessed York. He forgave everyone. He asked if dinner might be arranged. The battle had lasted less than an hour. Historians still debate whether St Albans should even be called a battle. More a skirmish, really. 45 minutes of street fighting that killed perhaps 60 men, a rounding error compared to what was coming. But the number obscured the significance. 3 of England's most powerful nobles dead in a single morning. Somerset, Northumberland, Clifford, Lancastrian pillars erased, their heirs remembered. The new Duke of Somerset was a young man named Henry Beaufort, who learned at St Albans that the Yorkists had killed his father. The new Lord Clifford was another young man, John, who learned that his father's body had been stripped and looted in a market square. These boys grew into men with one purpose: vengeance. Personal, absolute, generational. The cycle had started. York returned to London as Lord Protector again, carrying the wounded king like a trophy. Parliament met. Attainders were discussed, then dropped. A fragile peace was declared. Everyone pretended the street fight had been a misunderstanding, an excess of zeal, something that could be papered over with pardons and promises. No one believed it. Margaret retreated to the Midlands with her son, gathering loyalists, writing letters, building the army she'd need when the pretence collapsed. She'd been away from St Albans, luck or planning had kept her safe, but she'd lost Somerset, lost her power base at court, lost the fiction that Yorkists could be managed through normal politics. What replaced that fiction was simpler: kill them first. The next 4 years became a slow-motion duel, neither side strong enough to finish the other, both sides too bloodied to forget. Skirmishes at Blore Heath, standoffs at Ludford Bridge, York fleeing to Ireland, Warwick fleeing to Calais, nobles switching sides, then switching back, calculating odds like merchants pricing cargo. England was learning a new arithmetic, one where loyalty was measured in steel and settled in blood. Before we see how this ends, understand one thing. St Albans killed 60 men and doomed 60,000. Every death that followed was interest on that first debt. The payment was coming due. Victory arrived dressed as a funeral. September 1460, Richard of York rode into London through streets lined with cheering crowds, his banners snapping in autumn wind, his army filing behind him in disciplined columns. Warwick had already smashed the Lancastrians at Northampton. Henry VI was captured, again, and installed in comfortable captivity, smiling at everyone, understanding nothing. Margaret had fled north with her son, the court's power was shattered, and York, after 5 years of exile, rebellion and near execution, finally held all the pieces. He walked into Parliament and did the unthinkable. No announcement, no negotiation, no pretense of restoring good governance or removing evil councillors. Richard of York strode to the empty throne, placed his hand upon it and stood there, waiting for a claim that didn't come. The Lords stared. York expected recognition. He'd convinced himself, somewhere in the Irish exile, that England wanted him as king, that the legal argument, his descent from an elder son, his superior claim by blood, mattered more than 50 years of Lancastrian rule, that showing strength would trigger submission. Instead, there was slants. Even his allies were appalled. Warwick had risked everything to restore York to power, not to crown him. The Archbishop of Canterbury had blessed this rebellion as loyal service to the king, not usurpation. By reaching for the throne directly, York transformed himself from protector to pretender, and pretenders got executed. Historians still debate whether York's throne grab was planned or impulsive. What followed suggests desperation rather than strategy. When Parliament refused to acclaim him, York retreated to legal arguments, submitting a written claim tracing his genealogy through Lionel of Antwerp. The Lords appointed a committee to study the matter, which meant delay, which meant time for opposition to organise. The compromise that emerged was called the Act of Accord. It was poison wrapped in parchment. Henry VI would remain king for life, but his son, Prince Edward, would be disinherited. York and his heirs would inherit the throne after Henry's death. The Lancastrian dynasty would end not with a battle, but with a signature. York accepted. He shouldn't have. Consider what he'd actually done. He'd declared Margaret's son illegitimate in everything but name. He'd told a mother that her child's birthright was forfeit. He'd given Margaret, who would have compromised, who might have accepted power sharing, who had been negotiating through intermediaries, a reason to fight that transcended politics. This was now personal. Margaret's response was immediate. From the north, from Scotland, from France, she gathered everyone the Act of Accord had injured. The disinherited prince became a rallying cry. The Queen's army swelled with men who understood that if York's claim succeeded, their own positions were worthless. Better to gamble on war than accept a future where Yorkist loyalists took everything. The numbers favoured her. York had won New London, but London wasn't England. The north remained Lancastrian. Wales was hostile. Scotland offered troops in exchange for border fortresses. By December, Margaret commanded an army larger than anything York had faced, and she'd positioned it to cut him off from his southern allies. York made his last mistake. Instead of waiting for Warwick's reinforcements, instead of holding defensible positions, he marched north with a fraction of his strength. Pride, probably, the need to crush opposition personally, to prove his kingship through victory. He celebrated Christmas at Sandal Castle near Wakefield while Margaret's army gathered in the frozen fields beyond. The trap was set. York knew he was outnumbered. His advisors begged him to wait, to fortify, to do anything except ride out against a larger force on terrain Margaret had chosen. The Earl of Salisbury, his most experienced commander, counselled patience. York rode out anyway. Some sources say he was tricked, that a feigned retreat drew him into pursuit. Others say foraging parties were ambushed, forcing him to respond. What's certain is this. On December 30th, 1460, Richard of York led a sortie from Sandal Castle against an enemy he couldn't defeat. He was dead before nightfall. His son Edmund, 17 years old, was captured trying to flee. The new Lord Clifford, whose father York's men had killed at St Albans, found the boy at Wakefield Bridge. According to chronicles, Edmund begged for mercy. Clifford's response, "By God's blood thy father slew mine, and so will I do thee." He stabbed the boy repeatedly. Richard of York's head was mounted on a pike above York's Micklegate bar. Someone placed a paper crown on the rotting skull, mockery of his pretensions, a joke that would echo through centuries. The Act of Accord had lasted 12 weeks. Its author was dead, his heir murdered, his claims seemingly extinguished. Margaret had won. Except Margaret's victory had created something worse than a pretender. It had created a martyr. The head rotted slowly in the winter air. Frost preserved it at first, Richard of York's features recognisable for days, the paper crown frozen stiff, a mockery visible to every traveller entering the city through Micklegate Bar. By January, the crows had found it. By February, the face was gone, but his son was watching. Edward, Earl of March, was 18 years old and 200 miles away when messengers brought the news. His father dead, his brother Edmund murdered on a bridge while begging for mercy. His uncle Salisbury, captured, then executed by Lancastrian lords who wanted to watch a Neville die slowly. Edward reportedly said nothing for a long time, then he started killing. Historians still debate whether Edward's transformation was calculated or something darker. Grief curdled into rage. Mercy burned out of a young man who'd seen what mercy got you. What's documented is this. Within 2 weeks of learning his father's fate, Edward annihilated a Lancastrian army at Mortimer's Cross. The battle itself was brutal but conventional. What came after was not. Owen Tudor, grandfather of the future Henry VII, second husband of the widow of Henry V, was captured alive. The Welsh knight had fought with honour, expected ransom, assumed the old rules still applied. Edward had him dragged to Hereford's Market Cross and beheaded on the spot. Tudor didn't believe it until the blade fell. Witnesses recorded that even kneeling at the block, even as the executioner raised his axe, Owen Tudor couldn't comprehend that this was actually happening. He'd been beheaded before he fully understood he was going to die. His head was placed on the Market Cross. A mad woman combed his hair and lit candles around it. Edward had learned the lesson Wakefield taught. In civil war, captured enemies become future enemies. The old chivalry, ransom, parole, honourable imprisonment, was a luxury neither side could afford anymore. Meanwhile, Margaret's army marched south, and Margaret's army was hungry. The force that had destroyed York at Wakefield was large, foreign and underpaid. Scottish mercenaries, French adventurers, northern levies promised plunder instead of wages. As it moved through the Midlands toward London, it fed itself the old-fashioned way, taking whatever it wanted from whatever villages it passed. The chronicles describe horrors. Churches stripped of plate, farms burned after looting, women dragged into camps, towns that surrendered sacked anyway, because discipline had collapsed and Margaret couldn't or wouldn't stop it. Every mile her army travelled created New Yorkists, families who might have stayed neutral now swearing vengeance for burned homes and murdered kin. She didn't care. Or rather, she cared about one thing only, her son's throne. If England had to bleed to secure it, England would bleed. If peasants died, peasants died. The calculus was simple. Reach London, seize Henry, crush the remaining Yorkists, restore her son's inheritance. Everything else was acceptable loss. Warwick tried to stop her at St Albans. The Second Battle of St Albans, fought in the same streets where York had killed Somerset 5 years earlier, where this whole nightmare began, was a Lancastrian triumph. Warwick's elaborate defences, his handguns and caltrops and carefully planned fields of fire, collapsed when Margaret's forces simply went around them. The Yorkist army broke. Warwick fled with the survivors, and Henry VI, who'd been sitting placidly among Warwick's baggage train, was recovered by his wife's forces. The gentle king smiled at Margaret. He blessed the soldiers who'd rescued him. He probably didn't understand he'd been a prisoner, or that he was now a puppet. Margaret had won again. London lay open. No army stood between her and the capital. The merchants and aldermen sent nervous delegations, promising loyalty if she'd only control her soldiers, if she'd only stop the plundering that was terrifying everyone. She couldn't promise that. The army wanted payment. The army had been promised London's wealth, and Margaret, for all her political cunning, had never commanded soldiers directly, didn't understand that troops who weren't paid and weren't fed became a different creature entirely, one that consumed everything around it, including the cause it supposedly served. London's gates stayed closed. The city that should have welcomed its queen instead barricaded itself against her army's reputation. Margaret hesitated outside the walls, negotiating, threatening, watching her support evaporate as Edward of York marched closer with a fresh army. And here's where it gets worse. Because Edward wasn't coming to negotiate. Edward wasn't coming to restore order or petition for justice, or any of the polite fictions his father had maintained. Edward was coming to take the crown. On March 4th, 1461, Edward entered London and cheering crowds. Within hours, he was proclaimed King Edward IV. Within days, he was marching north with the largest army England had ever assembled for. Civil war. Margaret retreated. The armies would meet at a place called Towton, and Palm Sunday would become a bloodbath. Snow began falling at dawn on March 29th, 1461. By noon it was a blizzard. Horizontal sheets of white that blinded men, clogged bowstrings, turned the Yorkshire plateau into a frozen chaos where directions dissolved and formations became suggestions. The wind howled from the south, driving ice crystals into Lancastrian faces, a meteorological catastrophe for the army defending the ridge. 50,000 men prepared to kill each other in a whiteout. The Yorkist army drew up on the southern slope, their backs to the wind, their archers able to see. The Lancastrian army held the northern rise, blinking into the storm, their archers loosing blind volleys that fell short and stuck harmlessly in frozen mud. Then Lord Falkenberg did something clever. The Yorkist commander ordered his archers forward, 1 step, 2 steps, just enough to bring the enemy into range. They loosed a single volley, then retreated. The Lancastrians, feeling arrows strike home, assumed the Yorkists were close. They fired back, and fired again, and again. Their arrows vanished into the blizzard, spending themselves in empty air. The Yorkist archers waited. When the Lancastrian arrow supply was exhausted, thousands of shafts wasted on upward snow, Falkenberg's men moved forward again. This time they gathered the enemy arrows from the ground, the arrows that had missed, the arrows that had fallen short, and they shot them back. Historians still debate whether this arrow trap was planned or improvised. What's certain is the result. The Lancastrian line was pinned under continuous archery while unable to respond effectively. Men with shields could cower behind them. Men without shields died where they stood. The infantry charge came next. Both armies slammed together in a collision that produced sounds no one who heard them ever forgot. The crash of plate on plate, the shriek of metal edges finding gaps, the wet percussion of blades entering flesh. The line stretched nearly a mile. Men fought in visibility measured in feet, killing whoever appeared from the white void, unsure if they were advancing or retreating or simply grinding in place. Hours passed. The battle became attrition. Pure, stupid, mechanical attrition. Men died of wounds. Men died of exhaustion. Men died when they slipped on blood-slick ground and couldn't rise before someone stamped on their throats. The snow turned pink, then red, then black with frozen slush. Edward IV fought in the front ranks. This was deliberate. The new king, 19 years old and 6'4", made himself a visible rallying point for Yorkist troops. His armour was distinctive. His golden hair escaped his helm. He killed men personally, methodically, with a stamina that terrified his own commanders, because if Edward fell, the cause fell with him. He didn't fall. The Lancastrian line began to crumble first. The right flank, hammered for hours, started giving ground. Men who retreated blocked men behind them. The retreat became a crush, the crush became a panic, and the panic became a rout. They ran toward the River Cock. The river was swollen with snowmelt, fast and deep and cold enough to kill in minutes. A small bridge crossed it, too small for the thousands now fleeing toward it. Men pushed, men fell, men drowned under the weight of men behind them. The bridge collapsed. What followed was slaughter. Lancastrian soldiers, still in armour, plunged into freezing water and sank. Those who shed their armour fast enough to float were swept downstream or killed by Yorkist pursuers lining the banks. The bodies piled so thick that later refugees crossed the river on corpses, a bridge of the dead that held long enough for hundreds to escape before it too collapsed under the weight. The killing continued until dark. Then it continued by torchlight. Edward had given orders: no quarter, no ransoms, no prisoners unless they were too valuable to kill immediately. The old chivalry was buried at Wakefield with his father's headless corpse. What replaced it was industrial murder, a systematic execution of everyone wearing Lancaster's colours. Dawn revealed the cost. The plateau was carpeted with bodies. Local villagers, pressed into burial service, dug mass graves for weeks. The River Cock ran red for days, churches for miles around filled with wounded men who mostly died anyway, their injuries beyond medieval medicine. 20,000 dead, maybe 30,000. The sources conflict because accurate counting was impossible. Too many bodies, too many graves, too many men who simply vanished into the frozen earth. The bloodiest day in English history, the battle is over. The real tragedy is just beginning. Because Edward had won a throne, but he hadn't won peace. Margaret escaped with her son. Henry VI escaped with her. The Lancastrian cause wasn't dead, just bleeding, retreating. North, waiting. And the man who'd made Edward king, the Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, was already calculating what a king owed to the man who made him. Those calculations would prove fatal. The Earl of Warwick had a problem with gratitude. He'd made Edward king. He'd won the battles, built the alliances, provided the money and men that turned a dispossessed earl into England's sovereign. By any reasonable calculation, Warwick was the second most powerful man in England, but Edward didn't act like it. The young king smiled at Warwick, honoured him publicly, granted him lands and titles that made him richer than most continental dukes. Then Edward ignored his advice. Edward married the wrong woman. Edward began building a faction of new men, the Queen's relatives, upstarts, people who owed nothing to Warwick and everything to royal favour. Elizabeth Woodville was the wound that wouldn't heal. She was a widow, a Lancastrian widow, beautiful and calculating and absolutely wrong for a Jarl, king who needed foreign alliances. Warwick had spent months negotiating a French marriage, a treaty that would isolate Margaret and her exiled court, a diplomatic triumph that would cement his indispensability. Edward secretly married Elizabeth instead. Historians still debate whether Edward's marriage was passion or strategy, a way to break free from Warwick's dominance, to build his own power base, to stop being a puppet king controlled by an overmighty subject. What's certain is the effect. Warwick's French negotiations collapsed in humiliation. His influence waned, and the Woodvilles rose, taking positions that should have gone to Neville allies, building exactly the kind of court faction Warwick had destroyed when it belonged to Margaret. The irony was suffocating. Warwick had made war against royal favourites. Now he was being pushed out by new favourites. He'd killed Somerset for controlling access to the king. Now the Woodvilles controlled access to the king. Everything he'd fought for, everyone he'd killed, all of it was leading back to the same place. So Warwick did what Warwick always did. He found another king. George, Duke of Clarence, was Edward's younger brother. Handsome, ambitious, stupid in the specific way that made him useful. Warwick married his daughter to George. He promised George the throne. He began building yet another conspiracy, another army, another attempt to replace a king who'd stopped being controllable. The first rebellion in 1469 succeeded briefly. Edward was captured. Warwick tried to rule through him, discovered that governing required the king's cooperation, and found that cooperation impossible to compel. Edward smiled, promised everything, and escaped at the first opportunity. The second rebellion in 1470 failed entirely. Warwick and Clarence fled to France, outlaws, traitors, everything Warwick had called Margaret for a decade. Then Warwick did the unthinkable. He allied with Margaret, the woman whose husband he captured, whose armies he'd slaughtered, whose cause he'd dedicated his life to destroying. Warwick knelt before her and offered his services. He would restore Henry VI to the throne. He would destroy Edward, the king he'd created. He would betray everything he'd ever claimed to believe. Margaret made him crawl, literally. She refused to speak to him for over an hour while he knelt on stone floors. She demanded his daughter marry her son, the Prince of Wales, binding his family to Lancaster's survival. She made him swear oaths that must have tasted like ash. Warwick swore them, because Warwick needed to win more than he needed to be consistent, because power was the only principle that mattered, because the Kingmaker couldn't exist without a king to make or unmake. The invasion came in September 1470. Edward, caught off guard, fled to Burgundy. Henry VI was retrieved from the Tower, confused, aged, barely functional, and paraded through London as the restored king. Warwick ruled, again this time as Lieutenant of the Realm, the power behind a throne occupied by a man who could barely remember his own name. It lasted 6 months. Edward returned in March 1471 with Burgundian money and Burgundian soldiers. Clarence, Edward's traitor brother, switched sides again. Because Clarence always switched sides, because Clarence's loyalty was as reliable as English weather. The armies met at Barnet, in fog so thick that men killed their own allies. Warwick died there. The Kingmaker, the man who'd shaped England's destiny for 15 years, cut down in the chaos, his body stripped and displayed in London so everyone could see that Kingmakers could die like anyone else. Historians still debate whether Warwick was a visionary or a monster, a patriot or a parasite. What's certain is simpler. He'd spent his life believing that power came from controlling kings. He learned too late that kings remember who controlled them, and Edward IV was very good at remembering. The wine arrived in a barrel large enough to drown in. George, Duke of Clarence, looked at the Malmsey, sweet, dark, imported at great expense, and probably understood. His brother the king had finally run out of patience. The treason charges were convenient fictions, but the execution would be real. February 1478, the Tower of London, a private death for a public traitor. Clarence had betrayed Edward twice. He'd allied with Warwick, fled to France, conspired to steal the throne. Edward had forgiven him both times. Family was family, even family that plotted your death. But Clarence couldn't stop, couldn't accept being second, couldn't live in his brother's shadow without trying to cast his own. The final conspiracy was almost pathetic. Clarence accused the Queen's family of witchcraft. He harboured men who spread rumours that Edward himself was illegitimate, that their mother had cuckolded their father, that Edward had no right to rule. He demanded trials, made scenes, behaved as if being the king's brother protected him from consequences. Edward convened Parliament. The charges were read: treason, sedition, slandering the king, threatening the succession. Clarence defended himself with bluster that convinced no one. The verdict was inevitable. The sentence was death. But how does a king execute his own brother? Historians still debate whether the Malmsey story is literal truth or dark metaphor. What's documented is this. Clarence died privately in the Tower, and persistent rumours claimed he was drowned in a butt of wine, either by his own request as a final indulgence, or because drowning left no visible wounds, or simply because the tale was too grotesque to resist repeating. Edward never explained. He attended Mass the morning after. He conducted business as usual. He never spoke of Clarence publicly again. Whatever fraternal affection had once existed was now compartmentalised, filed away in whatever part of Edward's soul had learned to function despite horrors. Because Edward had learned to function. The golden youth who'd charged into battle at 18, who'd mourned his father and brother with righteous rage, had become something harder. He'd won his throne 3 times, at Towton, at Barnet, at Tewkesbury. He'd killed Warwick, killed Lancastrians by the thousand, probably ordered Henry VI's murder in the Tower. On the same night he returned victorious from Tewkesbury. Henry died quietly. The official story was natural causes, the saintly king overwhelmed by grief at his son's death. The truth, universally assumed, was simpler. Edward couldn't afford a living Lancastrian figurehead. Henry was killed, probably on Edward's direct orders, probably by Richard of Gloucester, Edward's youngest brother, the one who stayed loyal, the one who did necessary things without complaint. Margaret of Anjou survived. This was arguably crueler than death. She was ransomed to France, where Louis XI kept her as a pensioner, a former queen begging charity from the monarch who'd used her as a pawn for decades. She died in 1482, impoverished, broken, her son dead, her cause extinguished, her enemies triumphant. She'd spent 30 years fighting. It had accomplished nothing except death. Edward's final years were peaceful by comparison. He grew fat, he kept mistresses, including the famous Jane Shore. He collected taxes efficiently and avoided foreign wars that would require parliamentary approval. England, exhausted by decades of slaughter, accepted stability even from a king who'd achieved it through fratricide. The wounds remained. Everywhere Edward looked, he saw gaps where people should have been. The nobility had been decimated, not metaphorically, but literally. Dukes, earls, barons, the great families that had governed England for centuries. Dead, attainted, impoverished, reduced. Some titles simply ceased to exist, their holders exterminated so thoroughly that no heir survived to claim them. The survivors were damaged. Men who fought at Towton woke screaming for the rest of their lives. Children who'd watched fathers beheaded grew into adults who trusted no one. The trauma embedded itself in family memories and cautionary tales, in a reflexive assumption that politics meant violence and power meant death. Edward tried to build something new. He promoted men of talent regardless of birth. He reformed finances. He created a court culture of luxury and display that distracted from the blood beneath. For 12 years, England enjoyed something resembling peace. Then Edward ate too much, or caught a fever, or simply wore out. He died in April 1483, 40 years old, leaving 2 sons, 12 and 9, and a kingdom that had never really healed. His brother Richard was named Protector. History was about to repeat. The boys were last seen playing in the Tower Gardens sometime in late summer 1483. Edward V, 12 years old, had been king for 2 months, though he'd never been crowned, never ruled, never done anything except wait while adults argued about his future. His brother Richard, Duke of York, was 9. They played, they attended lessons, they gradually stopped appearing at windows, then they vanished entirely. No execution was announced, no funeral was held, no explanation was offered, not then, not ever. The princes simply ceased to exist, swallowed by the tower's stones as if they'd never been. Their uncle Richard had made himself king by then. Richard III's path to the throne was a masterpiece of ruthless legalism. First, he intercepted young Edward before the boy could reach London, separating him from his mother's family, the Woodvilles, whom Richard despised. Then he claimed a plot against his life, arrested the Queen's relatives, executed them without trial. Then he produced a miracle. A bishop suddenly remembered that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, that Edward had been pre-contracted to another woman, that the union was bigamous, that princes were therefore bastards with no claim to the throne. Convenient, implausible, accepted by a parliament that understood the alternative was more civil war. Richard was crowned on July 6, 1483. Historians still debate whether he murdered his nephews, or whether the boys died of natural causes, were killed by someone else, or even survived in secret. The evidence is circumstantial, the theories are legion, and the bodies were never conclusively identified. What's certain is this: Richard needed them dead. Living princes were focal points for rebellion. Every discontented lord, every surviving Woodville, every man who'd prospered under Edward IV and now faced uncertainty, all of them could rally around the boys, claim to be restoring the rightful king, justify treason as loyalty. Richard knew this calculus because he'd watched it operate for 30 years. Dead princes solved the problem. Richard probably gave the order. He was constable of the Tower. The boys were in his custody. No one else had motive, opportunity, and the cold pragmatism necessary. The man who'd loyally served his brother through every horror of the civil wars, who'd fought at Barnet and Tewkesbury, who'd probably killed Henry VI himself. This man understood that sentiment was a luxury kings couldn't afford. But murder created its own problems. The rumours started immediately. Richard was a child killer. Richard was a monster. The disappearance of the princes, never acknowledged, never explained, became proof of guilt precisely because it was never addressed. Richard's silence condemned him more than confession would have. His support began crumbling. Buckingham's rebellion came first. the Duke who'd helped Richard seize power suddenly switching sides, claiming the throne for an obscure Welsh exile named Henry Tudor. The rebellion failed, Buckingham was executed, but the precedent was set. Even Richard's closest allies could turn. Henry Tudor became the alternative. His claim to the throne was laughable by normal standards, descended from John of Gaunt through an illegitimate line that had been explicitly barred from the succession. But normal standards had died somewhere between St Albans and Tewkesbury. Henry was Lancastrian enough to satisfy Lancaster's ghosts. He was not Richard, which satisfied everyone else. The invasion came in August 1485. Henry landed in Wales with French mercenaries and accumulated supporters as he marched. Richard gathered his army and moved to intercept. The two forces met at Bosworth Field in Leicestershire on August 22nd. The battle should have been Richard's victory. He had more men, better position, and the legitimacy of an anointed king. What he didn't have was loyalty. The Stanley family, whose forces outnumbered both armies combined, waited on the flanks, watching, calculating, refusing to commit until they knew which side would win. Richard saw Henry's standard across the field. What happened next was either heroism or suicide. Richard led a cavalry charge directly at Henry Tudor, cutting through the bodyguard, coming close enough to kill Henry's standard-bearer, fighting with a desperation that witnesses remembered decades later. He almost succeeded. Then the Stanleys chose. Their forces slammed into Richard's flank. His cavalry charge became a slaughter. Richard was unhorsed, surrounded, beaten down. He died in a ditch, the last English king to die in battle, his crown rolling into a thorn bush where the Stanleys retrieved it and placed it on Henry Tudor's head. The Plantagenet dynasty, which had ruled England for 31 years, ended in a Leicestershire field. Henry VII rode to London. A new dynasty began. The body was stripped naked before it was cold. Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, was slung over a horse like a slaughtered deer, his corpse displayed to every village between Bosworth and Leicester. No royal fervour, no royal funeral, no dignity. The man who'd worn England's crown was buried in an unmarked grave in a friary church, without ceremony, without monument, forgotten for 5 centuries until archaeologists found his bones beneath a parking lot. The Tudors wanted him forgotten, and the Tudors were very good at controlling memory. Henry VII's first act as king was marrying Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter, the prince's sister, the woman whose claim to the throne was stronger than Henry's own. The marriage united Lancaster and York, which sounded like healing but was actually absorption. The Yorkist rose merged with the Lancastrian rose into the Tudor rose. Then the rewriting began. Richard became a monster in official history. The hunchback, the child murderer, the tyrant who'd stolen the throne through deception and paid for it with divine justice. Every chronicler who wanted royal favour knew what story to tell. Shakespeare, writing a century later for Tudor monarchs, gave Richard a twisted body to match his twisted soul. Propaganda so effective it still shapes perception today. Historians still debate whether Richard was villain or victim, whether the Tudor portrait was accurate or convenient. What's certain is simpler. The winners wrote history, and the winners needed Richard damned. Because if Richard was legitimate, the Tudors were usurpers, and usurpers couldn't afford questions. Henry VII spent his reign eliminating anyone with a plausible claim to the throne. Warwick's son, the last male Plantagenet, was executed in 1499, attainted for a conspiracy, almost certainly manufactured by the crown. Pretenders who claimed to be the vanished princes were hunted, captured and hanged. The Yorkist bloodline was systematically pruned until no viable alternatives remained. It worked. The Tudors ruled for 118 years. Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, the English Reformation, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, all of it built on the foundation Henry VII laid at Bosworth. England became Protestant, became powerful, became an empire. The civil wars faded into chronicle entries and cautionary tales, but the scars remained. The English nobility that emerged from the Wars of the Roses was fundamentally different from the one that entered them. Families that had governed since the conquest were extinct. New men, Tudors, Seymours, Cecils, rose to replace them, men who owed everything to royal favour and nothing to ancient blood. The independent power of the great lords, which had made civil war possible, was systematically destroyed. This was perhaps the Tudors' greatest achievement. They learned the lesson the wars taught. Over-mighty subjects were dangerous. So they created a state where no subject could become over-mighty, where power flowed from the crown and returned to the crown, where rebellion meant not just death, but erasure, attainder, confiscation, the elimination of entire family lines. The price was paid in bodies. Somewhere between 50 and 100,000 English people died in the Wars of the Roses. Soldiers, civilians, nobles, peasants. Not large numbers by modern standards, not compared to the continental wars that would follow. But England was a small kingdom. Every death rippled through communities, through families, through the social fabric that held society together. The trauma lasted generations. Men who'd lived through Towton never fully recovered. Women who'd lost husbands, sons, brothers to the executioner's block never forgave. The distrust, the paranoia, the reflexive assumption that politics was a death game, these attitudes persisted long after the specific grievances were forgotten. And the lesson everyone learned was the same lesson Margaret had learned, the same lesson Edward had learned, the same lesson Richard had learned. Power is survival, and survival requires ruthlessness, and ruthlessness eventually consumes everything, including the ruthless. Margaret died in poverty, her cause defeated. Edward died young, his sons murdered. Richard died in a ditch, his legacy poisoned. Henry VII died old and rich and paranoid, surrounded by account books and informers, trusting no one, loved by no one, having built a dynasty on the corpses of everyone who'd come before. The system endured. The crown survived. The institution of English monarchy emerged from the wars stronger than ever, centralised, suspicious, absolute in ways it had never been before. The men who fought for it did not. The Nevilles were destroyed. The Beauforts were extinct. The Plantagenets were erased so thoroughly that their name survived only as a historical curiosity, invented by later historians who needed a label for a dynasty that never called itself that. What remained was a kingdom that had learned to fear itself. The Wars of the Roses taught England that civil war was worse than tyranny, that stability mattered more than justice, that strong kings were preferable to the weak kings, even when strong kings did terrible things. This lesson shaped English politics for centuries. The reflexive horror of disorder, or tolerance for royal excess, the desperate clinging to legitimate succession even when succession was contested. They'd seen what happened when succession failed. They never wanted to see it again. History remembers the battles. It remembers the colourful names, Kingmaker, Sun in Splendour, Crooked Dick. It remembers the drama, the tragedy, the Shakespearean sweep of rise and fall. It forgets the mass graves. It forgets the children who starved when their fathers didn't come home. It forgets the wives who searched battlefield corpses for familiar faces. It forgets the ordinary horror of a ruling class that decided murder was easier than compromise. The Plantagenets ruled England for 3 centuries. They produced Lionheart and Longshanks, the Black Prince and Henry V. In the end, they destroyed themselves more thoroughly than any foreign enemy ever could. The empire endured. The dynasty did not.